Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. Today we're discussing a surprising way that democratic debate is being stifled, speech is being chilled, and that's costing municipal taxpayers millions of dollars. This is through a process called Municipal Codes of Conduct and the integrity commissioners who administer them. Government accountability is without question a good thing. We should expect our municipal officials to conduct themselves respectfully and in a way that honors the people that they're elected to represent. That's the idea behind municipal codes of conduct, which in Ontario, municipalities are now required to adopt. But some councillors have found that these codes of conduct are being weaponized to shut down unpopular speech, including speech that is critical of other town councillors. Councillors are subject to the judgment of integrity commissioners who are taxpayer funded and often lack any legal training. Here today to talk about some of the concerns with this system are lawyers Asher Honickman and Douglas Judson. Mr. Judson is also a town councillor for Fort Frances and has been subject to some of these code of conduct issues. And Mr. Honickman is his lawyer. Thank you both so much for joining me. Now let's start with the beginning. Mr. Judson, I explained what a municipal code of conduct is, but what do they typically include, and what are some of the parts that you say can be weaponized against unpopular speech?
Thanks for having me, Christine. So codes of conduct find their genesis back in 2017, and that's when the Municipal Act was amended to require municipalities to put these instruments in place and also to appoint integrity commissioners to investigate any complaints that are made under them. Now, the problem is that the legislation from the province actually doesn't provide any guidance on what the scope of the code of conduct ought to be. So on a city-by-city basis, they're all over the map. And we have really no guidance as to what appropriate conduct measures ought to be in place. So as a result, there's many well-meaning codes of conduct that have resulted in significant overreach by integrity commissioners, and then municipal councils are ill-equipped to challenge the recommendations that are brought forward. So just as an example, in my own municipality, the code of conduct prohibits any council members from using, quote, indecent, abusive, or insulting words, tone, or expression toward any person. So that's obviously a very subjective and open-ended phrasing, even though on its face, you might think that that's perfectly appropriate. My code of conduct also says that I cannot speak in a manner that is discriminatory to any individual, but it provides no definition of what discrimination is. So there's examples like that across the province where integrity commissioners have been able to take advantage of that ambiguity and go after councillors for comments which in many respects I would say are fair game political expression.
Really, really interesting. Now, Mr. Honickman, once a complaint is made under a municipal code of conduct, what would happen next?
Well, under the Municipal Act, well, first of all, thanks, Christine, for having me on again. It's great to be here. Once that complaint is made, the integrity commissioner takes over if they decide that the complaint has merit. And there's not really much in the way of guidance for them to make that determination. It's really up to their discretion. And if they decide that the claim has merit, they move forward with investigating it. And as Councillor Judson and I learned, well, I think we'll probably get into this in the next segment, that investigation can take a very long time before it comes to fruition. And then eventually, if the integrity commissioner decides that there's been an infraction of the code of conduct, they can make a recommendation to council, and council has the ability to apply punitive measures against the council member.
So, Mr. Judson, I wanted to follow up on what you said earlier. This seems well-intentioned. How do you respond to people who raise that concern that, these cities should have codes of conduct. You shouldn't be discriminatory. You shouldn't be abusive. But how do you respond to that concern?
No, I think that's a live issue. And I don't think there's anyone saying there shouldn't be guardrails. Like certainly Asher and I are both lawyers, and we have guardrails in our practice as professionals. Mm-hmm. And I think public office holders at other levels of government have those rules that they have to follow too. And part of the reason that, we recognize there needs to be standards, that's really what's triggering the province to take another look at the legislation now and consider whether it's appropriate. And part of that is because there are examples of serious misconduct that I think we can all agree on are beneath the expectations we have of municipal office holders. So, for example, there are municipal politicians in Ontario that in recent history have been challenged with and are accused with sexual assault or sexual harassment allegations.
Yeah, we of course want a way to deal with that. But when we come back from this commercial break, I want to get into some specifics about how these codes of conduct might be misused. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about something called municipal codes of conduct that regulate how municipal city councillors conduct themselves, but which some critics are saying are being actually weaponized for political gain. Now, Mr. Judson, you are a town councillor in Fort Frances, and I want to talk about what happened to you specifically. There was a complaint made against you by some members of the public, and there was an investigation by the Integrity Commissioner. What can you tell me about the background of your situation and what happened there?
My situation was a really good example of how this can go off the rails. So it begins back when I brought forward a reconciliation initiative to our council to rename a street named for colonization, which our Indigenous citizens find very distressing and disrespectful.
And sorry, what was the name of the street?
Colonization Road. Something that is deeply upsetting to a number of people in our era of truth and reconciliation. So I thought we should have a discussion about whether that was appropriate. And as a result, the newspaper printed a number of anonymous criticisms of this. Many of them were deeply offensive. Some were identified as coming from a local senior's home, and I republished them and attributed them to a white senior citizen, even though I have no idea who the author is, other than that where they live and my general knowledge of the demographics.
You didn't cite a specific individual. You just said, I would assume this is written by...
No idea who wrote it.
But they're probably white.
They're in Fort Frances, yes. And the end result of that was a complaint alleging that was discriminatory per the Code of Conduct.
And so what happened next? So the investigation started after this complaint was issued?
That's right. So there was a decision made that comment did cross the line and that it should be investigated. And that kicked off an almost 1 year long process of communication with the Integrity Commissioner. And at the end of it, a $36,000 bill for taxpayers over attributing an anonymous person's criticism that, in my view, was racist towards a white person.
Now, Mr. Honickman, you represented Mr. Judson in this case, and you say that there were some serious procedural fairness issues with the way the investigation and the Integrity Commissioner's report was conducted. What exactly were those procedural issues?
Well, first and foremost, I got involved because the initial Integrity Commissioner wrote to Councillor Judson and said, I've received this complaint, I'm investigating it, and it appears you're guilty, basically. And I had to jump into the fray at that point and say, you've just given every indication that you're prejudging this case without hearing at all what my client has to say, without really investigating this matter. You're going to have to recuse yourself. That Integrity Commissioner he recused himself. A new one came on board. As Councillor Judson said, the investigation took a long time. Other procedural issues arose. Aside from the length of the proceeding, we never really knew 100% who had made this complaint. And that's a fundamental issue, of course. If this were a criminal case, you have to know who your accuser is. And it's not the same standard in municipal complaints, but there's still that fundamental importance of being able to make a defense. And especially when we know that complaints can be weaponized, it's important to know who the complainant is. Are they in touch with someone on council, for example? Do they have a prior history with the member where they may have some kind of personal vendetta? We weren't able to really explore that line, and it hampered our ability to really defend the complaint.
Now, Mr. Judson, what Asher just raised here was this concern about whether they were working with other municipal councillors. And this actually has been an issue in some other municipalities where there have been retaliatory complaints under codes of conduct between competing members of local council, basically using these complaints as a weapon against each other politically. What can you tell me about cities where that has happened?
Well, I do think there's a role for codes of conduct around some elements of accountability that we would expect. So, for instance, I would expect my peers to maintain the confidentiality of privileged information that comes to our attention. And I think it would be appropriate for a member of council to take recourse to an integrity commissioner for something like that. When it comes to political expression, though, that debate should happen in council, it should happen in the community, it should happen in the media. That's where that should take place. Unless the expression is engaging what we would call workplace harassment within the municipality, or some infraction of the Human Rights Code, or maybe even hate speech under the criminal code, I don't know how we suddenly have this other level of speech that we're going to prohibit within municipal office. I think that's a disservice to the type of debate we want to foster.
When we come back from this commercial break, I want to talk to you both about some of the stories from other municipalities in Ontario where this has been a problem. It wasn't just in Fort Frances, it's been raised as an issue elsewhere as well. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking about something called municipal codes of conduct, which are supposed to ensure accountability in municipal governments, but are in some instances being weaponized and used against certain members of council. Now, Mr. Judson, I wanted you to tell me some of the stories of other places where this has happened, because it hasn't just happened to you.
No, it hasn't. And I have exchanged war stories with council members across the province. And some of these I think are quite egregious. So, just off the top of my head, in Barrie, there was a young councillor who was sanctioned for making a comment that it looked like two federal politicians were, quote, playing footsies with white supremacists, end quote. In Cornwall, there was a councillor who was sanctioned for criticizing some actions of senior city staff on social media. And then in Hamilton, there was a member of a local municipal board who was sanctioned by the commissioner for criticizing the city's efforts on LGBT inclusion. So, I mean, those are all commentary. All those are examples of commentary that have been made with a view to serve the public interest in engaging in municipal affairs and civic debate. Whether we don't like those comments, they shouldn't be judicialized. They should be politicized, and they should be subject to debate and clarity through that process.
Now, Mr. Honigman, you have raised some concerns about this creating a chilling effect on speech at city councils on issues that really should be a part of democratic debate. Can you elaborate on that concern?
Absolutely. Let's keep in mind what the speech is that was impugned in this case. It was prima facie political speech. It was Councillor Judson in his role as a council member talking about what the name of a road should be, talking about other reconciliation initiatives, talking about the demographics of Fort Frances. All of that is political speech. And the Supreme Court of Canada has said political speech is the most protected form of expression. So there's no doubt about that. And so what we have to do is either read these codes of conduct narrowly enough that words like discrimination get read in a narrower sense to apply to real discrimination, like where if Councillor Judson didn't hire someone for his office because of the color of their skin. We have to apply it that narrowly, or maybe a bit more broadly than that, but certainly not to statements about describing an author of a comment as a white senior citizen. That cannot be discriminatory speech that engages a code of conduct and that engages an integrity commissioner investigation. And that's really the problem. And Councillor Judson pointed out a bunch of other municipalities where this has happened. I've seen some other municipalities as well. And the key point that I've seen, Christine, is that it happens on both sides of the political spectrum. Nobody is safe. You can be reprimanded for making an LGBT inclusion comment. Someone else can be reprimanded for making a comment that's seen as not being sufficiently inclusive of LGBT. And if we care about those issues being decided in the realm of politics and not in the realm of law and in the realm of judicializations, then people from both sides of the political spectrum need to come together in support of reforming the Municipal Act and these codes of conduct.
You raised such an excellent point point, Mr. Honigman. Mr. Judson, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you might describe yourself as progressive or left of center. It should be no surprise I describe myself as right of center, but I share a lot of these concerns. And what would you say about how this code of conduct weaponization can cross the political spectrum?
I think that's absolutely right, in that there are concerns from the left and the right on any issue. And we're not even talking about extreme concerns, but that contribute positively to the work of municipal councils. In Ontario, we don't have partisan municipal councils. So part of our job is to work with one another and have free exchange of ideas. And we need to be able to do that without this, the monster of this chilling effect on our backs. And that includes the communications we make out there in the community. One of the things that troubles me most about what I've seen about those complaints I described is that they all target newer members of council and young people that are the renewal of their councils. Now, I'm not making a comment about where they come from in their politics, but I think if you take stock of Ontario municipalities, you'll find they're very old, they're not very diverse. And if we really are serious about this level of government that's closest to the people, not stagnating and doing important things in the future, we need to foster new ideas and opening the door to free expression that perhaps others might find objectionable. We need to be able to share those ideas and perspectives on social issues.
Very well put. And as always, I support the right to expression, whatever it is you are expressing. When we come back, we'll dive into this further. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing municipal codes of conduct in Ontario, how they are supposed to improve accountability and transparency, but are in some cases being weaponized and chilling speech. Now, I wanted to ask you first, Asher, what is a way that the process of these codes of conduct could be improved that would still achieve the goal of accountability and transparency, but would remove the risks of weaponization that we've seen and which we've discussed today?
Thanks, Christine. Well, without getting too technical, one thing you can do immediately is amend the Municipal Act. As Councillor Judson was saying, the Municipal Act mandates codes of conduct, but doesn't get into what those codes of conduct include. The Municipal Act could set out what the codes of conduct shall include or shall not include, and could even include a charter statement that no code of conduct shall interfere with a member's ability to freely express political ideas. You could have something like that. It's just words on a paper, maybe, but I think it would go a long way in practice to stopping this sort of weaponization that we're seeing.
Mr. Judson, same question for you. What could we do to achieve the goal of accountability and transparency while removing the risks of weaponization? And what needs to happen to start that process?
I agree with Asher. And I think what needs to happen first is we need our provincial government to take some leadership and listen to the feedback, because they are getting feedback from municipalities that this has become an out of control cost center at, never mind all these political concerns. And I think that what that looks like is probably a centralized, standardized code of conduct, probably a centralized commissioner or ombudsman to provide some centralized codified norms of procedural fairness. But if we don't get that, I think the tool that's available is municipalities need to take a good, long, hard look at the code of conduct they have and customize it to control their risk, to control the jurisdiction of the commissioner, and make sure that there's off-ramps when things get off the rails.
Yeah, I think that people need to appreciate that these have real taxpayer implications. What can you tell us about the taxpayer implications of the current process, Mr. Judson?
Well, right now, both the Municipal Act and generally the contract you would have with your integrity commissioner completely indemnifies that person for any cost they incur. So if they choose to retain a Bay Street lawyer, like they did in my case, to help them, or if their decision is, really, or their recommendation is really bad and you choose to take it to court, the municipality is on the hook. Taxpayers are on the hook for paying for those expenses through every level of appeal all the way up. And I'm seeing what I would characterize as a disturbing trend of integrity commissioners using that mechanism to try to beef up their power by getting favorable court decisions in support of what is still a very vague jurisdiction in the Municipal Act.
Yeah, as we were discussing on the break, once you have some power, you use it to try and acquire more power. And there are jurisdictions where this process has resulted in, I think in Elliott Lake, it was $400,000 in just 2 years as a result of these integrity commissioner reports and complaints under the Code of Conduct. And Elliott Lake is a small community that cannot afford to waste taxpayer money this way. Mr. Honigman, I want to close with you. We as citizens, how can we try to make sure these changes happen if our provincial leaders aren't interested in amending the Municipal Act? What can we do directly as citizens?
Well, all democracy at the end of the day resides with citizens. And I have spent many years trying to encourage fellow citizens to become more engaged. Read the Municipal Act, read the Code of Conduct, go to municipal meetings, lobby your mayor or your council members. One thing I think that would go a long way is if senior council members in these various municipalities showed some leadership. And when a complaint comes in, and remember, it's the municipality that gets to decide if they want to adopt the Integrity Commissioner's recommendations. We need some leadership from senior council members to just say, stop. We're not going to do this. Over a term like white senior citizen, we're not going to sanction one of our members, and especially one of our junior members. And the way that happens is that members of the community have to show the senior members that that's an important thing.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for coming on today and sharing these concerns. It's a lot of food for thought. We've heard today about how a well-intentioned idea to bring greater accountability to city councils in Ontario may be backfiring by chilling speech, being overly politicized for personal gain, and costing taxpayers millions of dollars. The goal of the Code of Conduct system may be worthy, but if the law is undermining its own purpose, some common sense changes are necessary. But what do you think? Are these stories outliers, or is there some need for reform? Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.